the small team here at Fort Eustis and the chat room, which we were still sitting at around 100 earlier, as the day goes on, and those that are video streaming and the comments on Twitter, really the resiliency of our Twitter tweeter over there who's whipping them out as the time goes on has been pretty tough too, so we appreciate that. So we went from individual presentations from France, the Netherlands, Germany, UK, and Canada, and almost in every one of these cases, it came up continual mention of NATO and about fighting on a future battlefield as part of NATO or part of a coalition. So I think this panel today on discussion of NATO Operations 2040 makes a lot of sense on what we're talking about. So the way we'll do this today on this panel is I'm going to pass the mic down, and each individual will introduce themselves and tell you, their member country and what they do, and then Serge Dedepo, Serge, I've known you forever. I don't know if I could pronounce your last name very well, is going to talk a little bit about NATO 2040 and the effort that they're ongoing, describing their future operational environment from the NATO perspective. Then we'll have a conversation here with questions. We'll open up to questions here in the room and questions from the online community. So that's the way we'll go forward in the panel. So Serge, if you'll start off and pass it down for the introductions first.
Yes, thank you everyone for being with us. Good afternoon, good evening, or maybe good morning. I don't know who's online still. Thanks to all of you. My name is Serge Dedepo, as Lee introduced me, from NATO Transformation Command Innovation Hub.
Thank you for hosting us. My name is François de Cluzel. I'm a French NATO civilian and formerly French Army Lieutenant Colonel, freshly retired. I was hired as a NATO civilian 4 years ago now, after 3 years in Allied Command Transformation as a military. My background is rather a master of international relations rather than technology or something that is related to innovation, but that's how it goes in NATO.
Commander Dietmar Teufel, good evening or good afternoon. From ECT, Innovation Branch, the section Science and Technology.
Go ahead, sir.
So the purpose of this session, I think, is to have a dialogue, because we are not coming to present something, but maybe discuss some concepts. But still, I would like to put you in the picture. I will give a short introduction, and I think I have first to say that we are not speaking on behalf of NATO. We are coming with our own background and really happy to discuss things that we see, but we are not mandated to answer a question about what does NATO think about that? We don't know, and more than what is in the NATO published document, and I have all of them with me, guys. So if you want me to read paragraphs of what NATO think about China, Russia, it's there. I don't need to make it up, all right? My opinion, if I speak, it's just my opinion. Same thing for my colleagues, and trying to help everyone understand the future environment. Now, when military from nations talk about NATO, they usually put themselves in kind of us and them. I mean, I am Belgian army, and NATO is a bunch of other guys I have to figure out how to work with. And I hear that from each single nation often. But actually, from our NATO non-national point of view, NATO are all of them, or all of you guys. You think, oh yeah, there is NATO and me. No, there is no NATO without you. Everyone is part of it. And I see also that many nations are developing their military strategy and operational processes, thinking we need to work with other nations, allies, partners, and we have the challenge to figure out how we will help them work with us. From the NATO point of view, we think about the same issue, but not in thinking, how do we get those guys work with us? No, how do we work together? And that's a slight difference, but still shows the specificity of us. We are not coming from this is happening in a nation and we need to get the other way around. We'll take all the nations, the 29 nations, say how can we have them work together better? And that's really the specificity of NATO, trying not to take one national solution and export it, but to figure out how all those 29 kids in the playground could actually go along together better. So it does not mean only the procedures in the military, but also the strategy and the conceptual understanding of an operational environment or the threat, the global environment. And it's not only about military things, but also about perception of what this planet is going towards and how we want to navigate it. And so that's really the basics of NATO, so 29 nations, 2 on this continent, and this is North America, the rest in Europe. One important point about NATO is that it defines itself not as a military organization, but a defense and security organization. And its purpose, as written on the website, I'm not making that up, is to find a peaceful resolution to disputes. And you understand that that's not just a military tool, even if often you see military NATO in the news about military operations. And they say in Brussels, we can use crisis management operations if we fail before. If the rest has failed, there is a crisis management operation. I think those words have some importance. And that type of operation can leverage military or not, before, during, and after a conflict. And so it's very wide scope, I think, that we are trying to address in NATO. Of course, some people focus more on the military part of some elements of it, but the NATO as a whole is really a political organization with a strong military arm, but focusing on strategic level, global issues, and how the 29 nations understand them and prepare for those crisis management operations. We have here in the US one NATO military command, which is called the Transformation Command, not far from here. This is why we can be here on site with you. And that command is totally dedicated and figuring out the next conflict, the next operation, the future. And the people working there are focusing some on policies, on strategies, others on developing new capabilities, training, developing the force, but they're really focusing towards the future. I think that's the point of today's debate. And this is what we do for a living with those gentlemen and many more working in our HQ. The approach of the future, without going into details about who we think is an adversary or a friend, is, from our point of view, is really to think about we don't want to be surprised. Military skills is a lot about surprising and not being surprised, and we all agree on that, and we all have also military backgrounds. We've been educated in that field, and it's safe to say that for the future, which is unpredictable, we don't want to be surprised, and we want to be able to surprise others. Another key aspect of that, in the not being surprised, is to be able to adapt, because we will be surprised. It does not happen then when there is a conflict, you are not surprised, all right? It would be too easy. Basically, if there would be no surprise, probably we would not need the military forces. So there will be surprises, and that we need to adapt, and adapt fast. That is a key point of our job in a NATO Transformation Command. Also, we are part of a small entity that is called the Innovation Hub. And the specificity of the Innovation Hub is to take all of the problems of our command with the angle of open innovation. So pretty much like you do with a mad scientist, is to go outside of the box, invite everyone who is willing and able to help NATO solve its issues to join. And so we are really looking into having not only all you guys here, not only all those who are online, but anyone, anywhere, anyone able and willing to help NATO. We try to get them into our projects to help them, to help us understand and solve issues. And so when I look into the future of the operational environment, and you will hear very soon about operations in 2040 from our side, one of my interests is to figure out how the broader public, that human capital that is not wearing a uniform but is willing to help NATO, can actually be leveraged for that future environment. Another thing that we are doing also with the Innovation Hub is the agile development of solutions. So we have recently baptized lab, which has the function to develop minimum viable products extremely fast. And it's directly linked to the ability to adapt in things that you face a problem, you must be very fast in delivering the solution, giving it to the troops. Those who are in operation and who are facing the problem need to get a solution very fast. And this is another angle of approach really of our organization, is to see how in the future that idea that an issue pops up and we solve it very fast, is projected directly to those who need it, how much it will be part of tomorrow's forces. So the thing that we do now with our small lab based in Norfolk, Virginia, how it could become an embedded capability in future operations, that there is that strength and capability to fix anything very fast, maybe from the reach back position, and send it to those who need it. We are addressing those problems with everyone who's doing the same thing in the 29 nations, and we call this the NATO Innovation Network. So the way you work with mad scientists, the way we work in the Innovation Hub, there are many nations that have that same approach to solving problems in an open way, in an agile way. And so we have created the NATO Innovation Network, being the network of those entities who is doing the same thing. And I think that's also part of how we envisage the future operational environment. We think that what we do as an innovation lab might be in the future an operational capability, and it's actually developing in many nations. And we try to get all those entities be interoperable, work together from peacetime, so that when there is conflict or operation, it's leverageable. And so you will hear very soon by François and Dietmar about the current project that we have launched. We are launching, actually, it's not really public now, but it will be public in a few days, that we call Operations in 2040. Totally linked to what you are exploring also with mad scientists. I don't know, François, if you want to say something about that before the questions.
So I just want to add some information on the study that we're currently running. So a little bit of history first. As Serge said, we opened up the Innovation Hub 7 years ago, and as part of our task, one part of the task is to crowdsource the potential issues that NATO face at a not classified level, of course, to a very large number of people, number of nations, etc. And back in time, we have created some studies for NATO by just by leveraging the crowdsource, and it worked pretty well. And the current Supreme Allied Commander, General Natal, back in December, called us and said, I really appreciated one of the documents that you produced back in 2014, and he said, I would like you to do the same with the NATO warfare capstone concept that is currently being developed by the command. So the regular study, I would call it the regular study because we are the irregular ones. The regular study has started back in June and was commended or ordered by the highest level of NATO to ACT. So there's a team that has been working for 7 months on this. We've been asked to start in December, and we have to produce something in March. So the challenge is huge, of course. And we try to build that study based on the same process that we use to develop some studies over the time. So it's just by bringing a community together and bring them to collaborate mostly for free for us, and trying to leverage expertise from non-traditional actors. So that's it. The goal of our study is to challenge, really to challenge the regular study and also to inform it. So how do we proceed? So the first step for us, so it's a twofold study. The first step for us is to describe the future operational environment, as you did over the day. Well, what I've heard is exactly aligned with what we have started to do, but it's in 2040, which is very challenging. It's not in 5 years from now. It's more than that. The second step is to describe the military instrument of power that NATO will need to maintain. Will need to maintain its military edge in 2040. So describing what we need, and if we still have time to do that, all the associated capability development that will go along with the description of that future operational environment and the military instrument of power. Of course, I doubt very much that we will have time to describe the capability development required for 2040, but that's part of the very ambitious plan, that task that we got from the general. So I will leave Dietmar explain how we proceed, how we describe the way we are going to. We are already doing it right now. It's really a copy paste of what you do with the mad scientist, and we need your help as well for that.
Yeah, I will describe and say why we do it. If you write a concept or study in the past, we often, made a workshop with SMEs, military, brought them 1 week in a room, made a concept, write it down, and on the end we had a linear development, and which has the risk that is maybe after some time, if you have a black swan, obsolete. And I found another new term. I don't know if it's actually from the US Army. It's pink swans. Everyone what is a pink flamingo. Pink flamingo. And I like that very much. We talk a lot about things in the technology field like AI, data science, quantum computing, and so on. So when we know something is coming, but we still think linear forward and not say, should we not prepare that we will be surprised in future because finds something out with technology and use this technology in a way which will be disruptive? Maybe not the technology itself, but how to use this technology. And I think with out-of-the-box thinking and also with external expertise, and this is a little bit of focus of this study, get external expertise out of our, I would say, peer group in the NATO, maybe we can show some of the risk for the future about that.
So that's very interesting. A couple of things before we ask you some questions and we can have a conversation around these ideas. Mad Scientist, originally when it was developed, the big idea or what we were told we were supposed to do by our big boss was, how do we leverage the nation's intellect? How do we bring the nation's intellect to the United States Army? So the idea of Mad Scientist was to go out and try to connect to as much of that intellect as we could and to have a continued dialogue and conversation about how we thought about the future and the challenges that the Army faced and what the opportunities could be. That is very similar to what you're doing. You are trying to harness or connect to leverage the intellect of NATO. It just scales up. So this idea of doing that was also about peer reviewing what we thought about the future. So that's why all of our unclassified work we put out on the MadSci lab or other places, looking for people to be critical about what we have talked about. Not looking for confirmation, but actively seeking people that will be critical to what we've stated, because everybody agreeing isn't that helpful. You're actively looking for those that might disagree. So in that nature, we're basically first cousins. And where I come from, first cousins get married, so that's pretty close. So I know that makes you Europeans nervous, but I'm from the southern Mississippi. I'm from the south of the United States. So in that piece, your challenge you're looking at as you look at describing operations for NATO in 2040. I think clearly, and as we've talked about, clearly the MadSci community of action is one of the people that is going to work with this, and we've already started that today, which as soon as I got a call from the team here and we talked about what we wanted to do today, they were immediately like, great, that's a start point for what we have to do. Interesting enough, when you talk about the innovation lab at NATO, a couple of years ago, at the direction of the General Milley, who at the time was the Army Chief of Staff and now is the chairman, had directed TRADOC, and a portion of this now is Army Futures Command, to do a 2050 war game. And we did a 2050 war game, brought together experts from across the Army, DOD, outside of the Army. And one of the things that came out of that, which really the Army has not embraced, was the idea that to win on the future battlefield, you would have to have some element that's mission was to help the combat forces to rapidly adapt. It would to inform agility. So from the idea of the institution, that's what the NATO Innovation Lab does. And the institution, is Army Mad Scientist does that. There's some other parts of the Army that does that. But this was the sense that operational adaptation was critical to winning, and that somebody had to do that. So, where is the example of that? In our wars for 17 or 18 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, around our Joint IED Defeat Organization, we built some tactical arms, Paladin and a couple of other ones, that they focused on tactical adaptation. Your forces that operated alongside us were the benefit of some of these capabilities. But when I hear you talk about the mission of the NATO Innovation Network and the NATO Innovation Lab and building agility, and all of that is interesting, but how do we operationalize that for the future fight, where rapid innovation on the battlefield to an adversary's rapid innovation is allowed to happen forward, and not requiring, because it's all about speed, right? It's going to be all about speed. So I thought that was interesting. And then your key to preventing surprise. So this is there are all kinds of surprise. There's Pearl Harbor surprise. There's some kind of technological surprise that you mentioned, the pink flamingo that shows up. There's some people that thought that the 5G issue with China, that was a surprise, when it really wasn't a surprise. It was all over the news. It was well known that the Chinese had quickly invested in 5G infrastructure, and what that might mean as far as access for the Chinese and where that operated. So I think surprise is very interesting. So those are a few things I thought that connected to that. And as we go on, what I would like to do is think back to some of the pieces that some of the early officers talked about. So as I've, I guess I knew this, but I was reminded of it. One of NATO's premier missions from a military standpoint is interoperability, to try to build interoperability within member nations and their forces. So this came up in almost every discussion today. It started off with the French officer, and he talked about interoperability, and he talked about interoperability all the way down to the company level. And it was clear that he was thinking about interoperability from a classic stance of that we can communicate to each other on radars. We could probably pass fires data. We could share ISR outputs rapidly. This kind of what we think about classic interoperability. Then we had the officer from the Netherlands present, and they have a very interesting idea of interoperability, because they're just completely integrated with the German army, all the way down to the company level. Where there's a brigade, there's a battalion there's a Dutch battalion. Where there's a battalion, there's a German battalion, there's a Dutch company, and all the way down. Full integrated interoperability, to the point to where they have signed policy now that they will only buy equipment that supports that between those two countries, both member nations of NATO. And then in a later discussion, we talked about emerging technologies and interoperability. We talked about artificial intelligence. Almost every member country has a different view on artificial intelligence, its integration. Some are really against any idea of black box AI, where you don't have transparency of what the algorithms are doing. Some countries might be more more willing to do that. There's all kinds of different viewpoints. If you watch the movement Stop Killer Robots, some member countries in NATO are actively involved with Stop Killer Robots as far as the role of autonomy and that piece, and some are not. So there's a lot here on interoperability. So what I'd like to do is talk to you a little about interoperability, if anybody's interested in taking that on, and the different aspects of what interoperability would mean. Because for this 2040, operations in 2040, I would guess that, when you're talking about this OE, you also have to talk about what are the interoperability demands in 2040, which are going to be more complicated than they are today, and I would argue we're not very good at it today. So who's willing to take that first big question on?
I will take it because I'm sitting next to you, cousin. But they will have to.
I know he has some feelings about this. So.
Yeah, I will get that to Dietmar too. But there's actually something that we debated in a previous project, and I think what we will tell you all is what we got from discussions in previous projects, not NATO point of view, but things that we have heard. And definitely we had a project that was about the policies and consequences in operations of autonomous systems. And so clearly, as you said, the people in NATO understood that it was bringing a new dimension to the interoperability understanding on how to behave in operations and next to the operation, because actually it goes beyond what we have been preparing for. And definitely it was a real challenge, because when something is happening in operation led by humans, they can kind of pause and discuss it, and they own their capabilities. And the point that was put forward about that is when we will be working with mainly autonomous systems and AI, you might not be able to pose it, and you might maybe not be able to know who is in control of it. And so basically, ahead of time, how do you plan for no problem to happen? Because in the operation itself, might not be possible. And there is what you mentioned. Nations have different opinions and regulations and ethical concerns about how this could be actually achieved. And I think that as of today, the question is not answered yet. How will we design those AI so they are interoperable, but also do what people want them to do?
Okay, now you have me. I will not talk now 1 hour about technical interoperability. If you talk about interoperability, it goes down from the technical level, so systems can communicate with each other or synchronize each other, until actually the strategic level, if you talk about doctrine, how we fight wars, how we do operations together. So this is all, would say, interoperability. And the NATO aim in this is actually very clear. It says day 0 interoperability. So from day 1 in operation, we want to be full interoperability on all levels. This is a high aim, and we have a lot of challenges, but this is very clear. We are a consensus-driven organization with 29 nations, and to ensure interoperability, between 29 nations, including partners. I see some partners here who have a different industrial background on the technical level, for example, who have maybe also a different mindset how to do operations. This will be an ongoing challenge in future. This should be clear, but it has to be in the focus if we want to reach our aim of the zero interoperability. And I can give you a good example. If we talk about AI and drones, and there are first exercises with swarming. So in future, there is a US Army swarm and a German Army swarm, probably. So how we can communicate with each other. The ideal world would be if there is an operational need, we can join and can merge these swarms or divide them, independent who actually constructed these swarms. The lowest level of interoperability, we have to do a deconfliction. You know, every section has their own swarm. And I think for this example, it would be a challenge because we have to go on a technical level, which means sharing technical information, which is, of course, highly sensitive in the future. Will the industry give us the information about algorithm, for example, which is their industry business model to sell them. So the swarms, some weapon systems today will highly likely first black boxes for us. So we have to think through that, and we have to think, what I say in the Navy, before the wave, before we have the systems purchased, and we use them and find out where overall not interoperable with each other.
I'm not an expert of interoperability, but of course this is a major concern for our headquarters. We have exercises all year long. We have a federated mission network that was derived from that kind of issues that we faced in Afghanistan. So I know it's a major concern. Now, what I can tell from a very practical point of view is we try to bring innovation every year in our exercises, even though sometimes it requires from us to change our processes because we are a big machinery, a slow one, and innovation goes faster than we do. But it's a major concern. And interoperability is definitely one of the key points of our headquarters.
An interesting question that somebody asked. An argument can be made that the diversity in NATO countries' approaches to incorporating emerging tech could be an advantage and require a common adversary, which I can say that our adversary names, Russia or China, to have to actually deal with that. Is there a way to turn this reality into an opportunity, or does it have to be from a Star Trek, the Kobayashi Maru, which I don't know if Europeans are into Star Trek, but the unsolvable problem, the challenge that we'll never get to able to fix. So can this be turned into an opportunity? I know probably our real computer scientists down there might want to, is that possible from a technical point of view?
I cannot talk about technical point of view. You can, but basically that's the bread and butter of NATO, making diversity an advantage, even if it comes with caveats. And now, if it's talking about the technical part of it, you want that, Dietmar? Are you looking like you want to answer the question or not? No, yeah.
There is no answer to this question. It's just an idea.
I know only the Australian term in the foreign policy of big problems. A problem which is already hard to define. There is an aim, and we have to reach as much as possible, but it could be that we're always behind that. So about thing. This is my personal opinion. But we have a little bit to separate to say diversity is a benefit. Yes, it is in thinking, and also maybe to be a little bit unpredictable, especially if it comes to operation on the battlefield, when it is a clear benefit. But if it hampers that we work together which is all about interoperability, then of course it's a disadvantage. So there's always a opportunity and a risk in that.
Anyhow, I think that point is extremely important because, to my knowledge, no one is trying to do that and saying, okay, it's not interoperable, but actually it could be a quality. So let's explore that. It's a really nice out-of-the-box idea for us. Now, if it is an advantage today, probably it's just because we have not been able to figure out how to proceed otherwise, and so we should learn and understand that. And definitely, of course, it's not a new concept that being clustered actually would isolate elements from a global threat, and I would hope that we can do that consciously and not just be a victim of it and saying, yeah, because we are not able to be interoperable, at least individual elements would be protected. I think we need to come up with an architecture that is interoperable and still be able to isolate nodes so that the network is not fully damaged by a threat. So work in progress, and not just on us, on everyone.
Yeah, it's very difficult to go against your culture. And the culture of NATO is diversity. But you have to have some form of interoperability to be successful on this future battlefield. It's just balancing what has to be interoperability, but how can you use diversity, which is considered to be an advantage, can that turn into a tech advantage? I think it's a very interesting, as you look at this idea of 2040, I think you pull a string there, and you might not have an answer, but it's worth getting that thought out a little bit. I thought that was a great question that somebody had. You mentioned, you mentioned pink flamingos earlier, and the definition of a pink flamingo, if you're online, is we hear a lot about black swans. In reality, you really cannot figure out what a black swan is. If you read the original book, the whole idea behind it is it's a thing that you could not predict. But much more useful were these pink flamingos. When you look down, these were the things that were just right there. We all knew that it was on the horizon. And we just couldn't bring ourselves to deal with it. So I also think that's something very interesting, because 2040 is a long ways out, but there are definitely 2040 pink flamingos. The one I would say that is clear is all the ramification of the explosion in biotechnology. We had the Dutch officer when he talked about can we put a hole in the dikes? One of the dikes was the people. He talked about human enhancement. We talked about the German officer talked about bio threats, synthetic bio threats. So, and they're all aspects to bio. What this idea of pink flamingos, I think one thing you got to think through is, what are those threats that aren't way out there that we just know we're online for, that matter to NATO, that really mattered to NATO to a point to where it has to be described. So, what do you think? Any ideas on pink flamingos? And don't get nervous. We're not gonna contact NATO today and say, Serge said this is a pink flamingo. Get on it or you're in trouble.
Thank you. That idea of those things that you know and you are not facing is really interesting to me, because one of the principles of our job at the Innovation Hub is really to listen to everyone, because when something bad happens, someone raises their hand and said, I told you. And that's true. It's just because at some point, consciously or not, we are not looking at that. And now the pink flamingo is something that consciously we are not looking at. And I would say there might be many reasons for that. But what I'm interested in, and I'm putting my psychologist hat on, is sometimes the sick people don't want to be cured because they prefer the sickness than the cure. And I'm not referring to specific pink flamingos, but there's things there that everyone knows that we should tackle it, saying I prefer to stay sick than to face the painful cure that we would have to go through. And so apply it to whatever you think. Now, in my favorite, and again it's mine, I'm really interested in something NATO hates, is the rise of the empowered individuals, the rise of the big corporations that actually minimize the impact of the states, in saying that some random people or some big companies are becoming much more powerful than the nations. So basically it negates the foundation of NATO. That's my favorite. And it's not a NATO one, it's just mine.
Well, that's actually great.
Well, very frankly, that's the first time that I heard the word pink flamingo, so my opinion is not really made. Well, by design, I'm very skeptical about this, because when something is supposed to happen, I would like to challenge it, say, okay, maybe it will not happen. I would love to start my study by the assumption that the dominance of air, for instance, cannot be assumed by NATO in 2040, which is probably not what people think. You know what I mean? I'm not sure that something will happen for sure. We would like to start with using the other ways. If everyone thinks that biotechnologies is the major threat in the future, we will probably start by thinking the contrary first, and then we'll see whether or not we're right. But that's just my point of view. But I will dig into the pink flamingos a little bit, because that's the first time I hear about that.
I could give some historical lessons. The history of Nokia and Kodak is very famous about that, I would say. But you have to be, so Nokia built the best mobile phones and was, I think, first #1 in world market, and not made the step to smartphones. And in Kodak, it was not make the step to the digital age with cameras. To say that, you have to be very careful. After it happened, it's always easy to do an analysis on why it happened. But forecasting it is a complete different business, I would say. So I'm very careful to say this could be a pink flamingo. I think what could be one, now I do forecast, is what actually the day was mentioned already. It is the maybe we think very fast in the military on the military instruments of power. And if we go one step back, and when it comes to time, so the state instruments of power. So, and if you look at the conflicts actually the last years, and maybe more in the future, they will be merged more and more. So, and if you look about domains like cyber and space, you have two domains where is no separation actually anymore. The domain in cyber is almost civilian. The same with space, you know. So you cannot say this is our domain and we are the rulers of this domain, which you can partially do in air or sea warfare. You make an exclusion zone. This thing could be a pink flamingo that we have in future much more, I would say, challenge ourselves how we work together to secure these domains.
I think we have a question from our virtual audience there, Mr. Kersey.
Roger. One final question. If the panel could address, how is NATO considering the emergent U.S. Army concept of multi-domain operations? How are you considering to implement it in terms of calibrated force posture, multi-domain formations, and convergence?
That's a pretty complex question. Is NATO, from the Innovation Office, have you heard anything as far as what the U.S. Army and our joint community now is looking at multi-domain operations?
So I don't know everything about what's happening in the U.S. Army, but I'm pretty sure that we are following the same track, you know, considering that global environment. And recently I was reading documents in which from the NATO HQ in Brussels saying that the NATO approach of the environment, they call it a 360 approach, saying they want to look at all the dimension of the NATO operation, the NATO mission, and that's that. So we have new dimensions that have been added up, let's say, to the catalog of what the military instruments of power are dealing with, but it's really that. And now, not offending anyone, the question is, okay, does it make sense to have, clustered or stovepipe services when what we are looking at is a big cloud of everything all together? And I think that's exactly the same approach that we have in our command and the US Army, to go multi-domain and figure out what is the best solution for the future, what is the best organization, what are the best capabilities, how do we structure them, that actually we can really be efficient in that multi-domain environment. Something.
I can give a general answer in ECT. Normally, if a concept, doctrine, or something is written, there's always a phase of review what the nations did already. So to see, not start from the scratch in many of the areas.
So I think that we've come to a completion on the panel. And I thought that there are some interesting points. First of all, I think everybody in the audience and the virtual community have an idea of what NATO is trying to do. Effectively, they're writing a 24 future operational environment, and they've asked the Innovation Command here to help them red team it, and they want to broadly do that. So as they move that out, you'll see information on that and how to contribute at the MadSci lab, which if you subscribe to, then you will know about the opportunity to help out the team. Yes, and then we got a couple of things we're trying to help them with, as far as with the USC ICT, where we've done some gaming in the past. So some of those pieces. I thought the interoperability discussion was interesting. It's a key line what's been talked about, and then also some of the ideas around pink flamingos and trends. So I think